welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
You know, Chris, today we're going back to the 18th century and we're going to look at the life and adventures of a man who history has just, I think, in many ways misunderstood. Because there's just so little information about him. We know more about him today than we used to, but there's still so many questions about that man. That's Blackbeard the Pirate.
Yeah, Ray, I'm pretty confident that many of our listeners, when they heard that we were going to be talking about Blackbeard, they probably said, "Aren't you glad it's another podcast?" And so here we are, getting ready to invest ourselves in the swashbuckling seas off the coast of North Carolina. And we find this really fascinating story of a man that when his name was mentioned, people would experience great fright. He was this guy that had, as they would say, fierce and wild eyes. And, he would just be very intimidating. But history you didn't know but should possibly paints a different picture of him. And so I'm looking forward to investigating the life and the actions of Blackbeard, or Edward Teach, or Edward Tack, or Edward Thatch, or whatever they want to call him, as I know that history kind of records different names as to his full name.
And that's true. I mean, you think about when the average person thinks about Blackbeard the Pirate, what do they think of? They think of the famous picture of this, bad guy standing there. Maybe they think of Hollywood movies they've seen about Blackbeard and how Blackbeard was portrayed. But I think as we talk about Blackbeard here today, Chris, people will see a different side of him. What one historian referred to as a kinder, gentler Blackbeard, not the, as you said, swashbuckling pirate that a lot of people think about. So let's just get started, Chris. When you want to think about someone, you want to start with their birth, but Blackbeard's one of these people we really don't know where he was born. I mean, I read that there's some evidence he may have been born in Jamaica. Then there's talk about England. But we really don't exactly know where he was born or exactly much about his early life.
No, except that we kind of get a small taste that there seems to have been at some point that his family is focused on Jamaica, where during this time we know that sugar is known as white gold. It was extremely desiring for people to make their rum, to use for other different purposes. And so we think, based on research, that Blackbeard's family, they left maybe England or wherever it is, and that, as a young boy, Blackbeard or Edward arrives to Jamaica, where they will actually live the high society. I mean, that's the thing about Blackbeard. I think he gets his drive for gold and for, glory, because that's how he grew up. He understood wealth. He understood the importance of wealth. And I think that he wanted to earn wealth on his own. And that led him into not the sugar business, but the treasure stealing business, if you will.
Yeah, his parents actually had slaves, African slaves there in Jamaica. So they were definitely of the well-off class. His parents were, and that's the background he comes from. Now, he's a pirate, of course, in the sense that he is doing what he is doing without the backing of a government. He sort of launches out on his own. He goes down to the Caribbean, into the Bahama Islands, basically, and he gets his start there in the Caribbean. Raiding ships and doing things like that. But the interesting thing about Blackbeard is that when we think about him, that scary image that I think he worked to portray, the way he dressed, the way he did his hair, he never killed anybody. There's no documentation that he ever killed anybody outside of that last battle that we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. First of all, he was able to grow a pretty nasty beard, it seems like. I mean, it could grow extensively long, and that sometimes he would take it, he would braid it into little pigtails. And, he would also, before going into battle, they said that underneath his hat, he would take these little fuses that would burn. And so all of a sudden, you've got the curling wisp of smoke that is coming from out underneath his hat. And as some said, he looked like the devil that was coming. And he's got pistols lining his breast. He is just all over the place. I mean, very intimidating. He is scary to behold. And I think that most people were simply intimidated that they just handed over whatever they had. And so he didn't have to fire a shot, because not only was he intimidating, but he had a large crew. His ship was loaded down with cannons and with guns and ammunition. And so the intimidation and the fear is what drew people to pretty much give him what he wanted, as you said, without even having to fight it.
You mentioned his ships. He's going to have two ships. His first ship he gets in 1717 when he's in Nassau there in the Bahamas. A guy called Steed Bonnet, 29-year-old of Barbados, sugar planter, sails into the Nassau harbor with his ship, the Revenge, and he's going to put Blackbeard in charge of that ship, and he's actually going to remain behind as Blackbeard goes out, using his image and his intimidation tactics, which he really nails down to a science, I guess. And he begins his career as a pirate, at least, as having his own ship, being over his own crew. And in October of 1717, he terrorizes the Chesapeake Bay up in Virginia, goes up to Philadelphia, New York Harbor, and he's constantly on the move. He never stays in a location more than 24, 48 hours. So by the time authorities can get to where he was, involved in pirating activities, Chris, he's already gone by the time they get there. He is a man on the move. And throughout his career, he's going to stay one step ahead of the authorities, one step ahead of his enemies, to where it's going to be a long time before anybody, well, not a long time. I mean, his entire career as a pirate is only about 2 years, but it's going to be a while before anybody can actually catch up to him. He's going to be a very successful pirate. After the Revenge, of course, he's going to get a ship that he renames Queen Anne's Revenge. Now, this ship was actually a ship that he intercepted. It was a French ship, and the crew on that French ship was not doing well. And of course, a combination of their sickness and Blackbeard's image and his intimidation, they just sort of handed the thing over to him. And he modified this ship. It was a French slaver ship, and he modified this ship for the guns and the food supplies he needed. And he would carry forth with Queen's Anne Revenge as his major ship.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned a couple of things there. First of all, 2 years is, I mean, everybody knows about Blackbeard today, and everybody is aware of his adventures, and it makes us think that this was some long, career. But living the life of a pirate wasn't that easy. It was very, very difficult. You were always on the run, and I think we have to be careful. And this is the beauty of history, is that you and I have basically been painting this softer, gentler side of Blackbeard. But he was still a pirate. Yeah. And he was still intimidating. And there are some pretty cool stories that have come out, whether they're true or not, you don't know. But, there's some tales, I guess. And right, every pirate's got a tale to tell. I mean, there's a story that's out there. And I thought that one story that I read, a tale from one of his crewmates, if you will, did mention that he would do acts of cruelty, and that he would bring terror onto the members of his ship, because he wanted them to be intimidated as well. He wanted them to know that he was the captain of the ship, that he was in charge, and that it was going to be his way or the highway. And One tale is that he told one of the guys that were working on the ship, he said, if I don't shoot one or two of my crewmen now and then, you'll forget who I am. Mm-hmm. And so he would just, if that was true, he'd go out there and he'd shoot one or two just to make sure that people knew that he was in charge. Another tale that was out there that he did is he made everybody they were drunk one night and they went down into the hold of the ship, and he filled it up with smoke. And he said, let's see who can last the longest in there. And, all of a sudden, all these fumes are just invading the hold of the ship. And you've got all of these other guys that are running out. They can't handle it. And of course, Blackbeard's the last one who's in the hold. And the tale has a few choice words that he says about his crewmates, if you will. But one of the things that he says, I'm a better man than all ye milksops put together. That I am the man. And I think by not harming them per se, but still instilling fear, whether it is your enemy or even if it's your own people, it made the sound, it made the image, it made the persona of Blackbeard. You don't cross them. And so, right, we think about his adventures, but not only was he intimidating as it related to the sailors and to his crewmates and others, but there's also the story of slavery that finds its way into this story of Blackbeard.
Yeah, I think Blackbeard, you talk about Blackbeard and his image and the terror he projected on people. I think that was an image that Blackbeard worked very hard to create. And I think he would probably be pleased that people view him in that kind of light. Of course, what a lot of people may also not know about pirates, especially a pirate like Blackbeard, working the coast of colonial North America and in the Caribbean, is that a large number of his crew were actually runaway slaves. It's estimated that at least 70 of the men in Blackbeard's crew were former slaves that had, found their way to his ship or one of his ships and had sought freedom there. And it's interesting that he didn't keep every slave who came to him. Every runaway slave who escaped and came to him, they didn't automatically end up on his crew. Some of them he would send back into slavery. And let's remember, this is a man who came from a slaveholding family. So some of them he would send back into slavery, but others of them he would take aboard his crew, and throughout his career he would take quite a few on as himself. And as far as what criteria he used to determine which slaves he would keep, which slaves he would send back, we don't know. We don't know the answer to that. But I think it shows this is a young man who is intent on making an image for himself and using anybody who he thought would be a good addition to his crew. So, and that's going to bring us to some of his great adventures and some of his more interesting actions, Chris, as part of his career as a pirate.
Yeah, it lets you see that the dynamics of Blackbeard were so different that he wrestled with a lot of things. And we don't think of pirates wrestling with ethical issues. But I think we see this because in one moment he's not violent, but in another moment, he really doesn't care about the freedom of any one person. In another moment, he's seeking personal gain through the looting of everything that's going on. And then in another moment, he's allowing his crewmates to take more of the treasure than maybe he takes. So he's all over the place with what he's trying to become or what he wants to be seen as. And so I think he wants to be seen as a villain who is not guilty of actually doing anything really, really heinous. You know what I mean? That he's bad, but he's good. And we've talked about this in the past with other people on our podcast, how they do really, really bad things, but in their own mind, they have this line that they don't want to cross.
Yeah, we talked about Henry Bear Lowry in a previous episode, and the word Robin Hood came up with Henry Berry Lowry, and you see the same thing going on here with Blackbeard. I've read several things that talked about Robin Hood using that kind of imagery to talk about Blackbeard. So it may have depended on which side of Blackbeard you were on. If you were poor, if you were out of the mainstream circle, so to speak, you may have liked him. On the other hand, if you were a rich merchant, you may not have liked him.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to probably his chief claim to fame is this adventure that takes place in Charleston, South Carolina in May of 1718. And that's his famous blockade. And Blackbeard went in with the Queen's Anne Revenge, along with a couple of other vessels that he had. And he basically prevented any ship from leaving the port of Charleston, and any ship entering the port of Charleston had to go through him. He was like the toll booth. And so as they entered or as they left, they faced him. And one of those ships that they came across had a group of prominent Charleston citizens on it. I mean, these were like high-ranking government officials, and they were on board one of these ships that Blackbeard stops and he boards. And Blackbeard will actually hold those prominent citizens hostage, and he's holding them hostage because he wants ransom. And the ransom that he wants is kind of interesting, and I would love to do a little more research to figure out why he requested. But the one thing that he requested was a chest of medicines, and we do know from studies of the research that's going on off the coast of North Carolina when they raised up, his ship, that just by the observations of what they found, that there was issues of syphilis that were found with these crewmates. So maybe he wants the chest of medicines because there's a lot of illness, there's a lot of disease that's on board the ship. But what he does is he sends one of his crewmates on shore, and he demands that the leaders in Charleston give him medicine in return for the release of these hostages. And evidently, Charleston didn't think a lot of these officials who were being held hostage. So they just waited a few days and they kept debating, and they were like, I don't know, maybe we'll take this one, take that. Who knows what was going on? But Blackbeard got really, really ticked off, and he almost killed them, the hostages, but he doesn't. He holds on, he gets the medicine, and he releases the hostages. And one unique thing that I found to be funny is he releases the hostages without their clothing. He makes them go back into the streets of Charleston without any clothes on, and he gets his medicine, gets the bounty or the booty or the boot or whatever they call it, and they go and they continue to find other things. But then what happens is, after he finishes Charleston, he goes up to Topsail, and he literally wrecks two of those vessels,
including the Queen's Anne Revenge.
Yeah, and many people think that he did it so that he could downsize the crew and increase his own share of the treasure. And I don't know if that's right or if it's not, but what we do know is he, runs aground these things. He loses several of his men. He gets more treasure, and then he goes to the oldest town in North Carolina, known as Bath, and it's there where the next part of his story begins.
Yeah, he ends up there in Bath, and he goes and he has a meeting with North Carolina Colonial Governor Charles Eden there in Bath. And we don't have a lot of records of the meeting between these two men. But I think it's safe to say that whatever they talked about, Governor Eden and Blackbeard the Pirate, whatever they talked about, it went well for Blackbeard, because a few years earlier, maybe not a few years earlier, but relatively recently, King George I of England had issued a pardon for people involved in the type of activities that Blackbeard was involved in. And Blackbeard goes to Charles Eden and basically requests a pardon. He wants to get his hands on one of these pardons, and he wants to be pardoned in part for what he did there in Charleston, off the coast of Charleston. And of course, the Governor Eden of North Carolina, he wants something in return. He's not just going to give this pardon to Blackbeard for free. So they wanted something in return, and what they got was Blackbeard's crew there in Bath. It increased the population of the city, which of course would help, especially since many of these men had experience with fighting. If they had to fight Indians or whoever, they would have additional men to help, and also additional people in the town. So there were things that they brought to the table so that Governor Eden would indeed grant them the pardon, and he did. He granted all of Blackbeard and his men the pardon that they had requested. And Blackbeard himself, along with a number of his men, are going to settle down in the little town of Bath, North Carolina. They're going to build homes. And Chris, on the surface, it's going to look like they have just reformed. These were, the pirating days were long behind them, and they were now going to be good, honest citizens. But that's not exactly what they were up to, Chris.
No, but it just shows so much about society, because here's these individuals that come, off the boats. They receive a pardon. They settle in this small little town. They're living the life of leisure. And not only that, but Blackbeard gets married during this time. Yeah. He's turning over a new leaf. He's beginning a new life. And I mean, given that the person that he's marrying is now his 14th wife, I mean, just stop there for a second. That 13 people before this one had found something interesting about Blackbeard, that they had decided to marry him. But he marries this new woman. Well, should we say woman, or should we say this new teenager? Because she was about 16 years of age. She's the daughter of the Bath County planter. And get this, Ray, the person that married them was the one that had given Blackbeard his pardon. Yep. The governor. The governor married Blackbeard to his 14th wife, who was 16 years of age, and just thinking everything's going to be great. They're going to settle down and, have the White House, the picket fence, and the dog, and they were just going to enjoy life. But Blackbeard can't stay seated for long. He can't stay in one place. And once again, get out the boats, boys. Let's go out into the open seas, and let's bring back to Bath the beautiful spoils of our work. And he's back on the water. And not everybody was happy with the pardon that he received, and not everybody was even happy that Blackbeard was still alive.
Yeah, you know what he's going to do? He's going to set up camp on Ocracoke Island out there on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and they're going to crank the machine right back up. They're sort of going back. We didn't really talk a lot about his Nassau days in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, but they sort of use Nassau as a raiding base, and they're going to use Ocracoke as the same thing. And in August, they are going to get their hands on a ship called a French ship, called the Rose Emily. And they're gonna be very happy with what they get on that ship. Over 180 barrels of sugar, bags of cocoa, all sorts of wonderful stuff that they can use and sell and all that kind of thing. And we talk about Blackbeard, using his image, his intimidation, but then not really hurting anyone, or at least not killing anyone. This is an example of what he does. He terrorizes the French crew. He has them all tied up. And then basically after some hours having them tied up and terrorizing them, he puts them on a smaller boat and basically waves goodbye to them. But in the process, he tells them, look, if this smaller boat hadn't been available, I'd have thrown you into the ocean tied up. But of course, the boat was available. So, you don't really know if he would have done that or not. And one researcher actually said that's the closest thing to walking the plank that they have actually found in the literature. And he's going to bring the Rose Emily back to Ocracoke Island. They're going to begin unloading its cargo, storing it on the beach there. Governor Eden of North Carolina, again, is going to help him out. He gave him the pardon. He married him to his child bride. And then he's going to give him full salvage rights to the French ship. Of course, Blackbeard's going to tell him, well, we didn't capture this ship. We just found it floating at sea, which was, not true. But I think Governor Eden probably had a don't ask, don't tell policy when it came to Blackbeard. Whatever Blackbeard said, we just accept that and we don't think about it too very much. Now, Governor Eden of North Carolina, Chris, was very friendly to Blackbeard. But the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, a guy called Alexander Spotswood, was not so friendly. And he was not ready to just sort of sit back and accept this idea that Blackbeard had reformed and was doing better. And he had been following Blackbeard. I assume he probably knew what Blackbeard was doing off the coast of Ocracoke. So he's going to send 2 expedition forces down into North Carolina. And this is actually illegal, Chris, what the lieutenant governor of Virginia is going to do. But he's going to send 2 expeditions in North Carolina, one by land, and the other, of course, by water, to go get Blackbeard. And he's going to go in, they're going to go into the town of Bath several days later, trying to find Blackbeard and his men.
Yeah, I go back to Spotswood, Virginia, and I mean, he sees that Blackbeard's a threat, and he's one. But I wonder if he wasn't just jealous of actually what Eden had. Eden had this relationship with Blackbeard where he's getting the spoils also. And I wonder if, I mean, you have a little competing rivalry between Virginia and North Carolina and this whole thing. And so Spotswood just decides, the best thing to do is just get rid of Blackbeard. And he actually puts a reward out. I think it's like £100 or something like that to the person who can destroy Blackbeard. And a lieutenant, Robert Maynard, has instructions that by any means necessary, you go and you find this guy and you hunt him down, and actually employs a pretty good strategy to be able to get Blackbeard captured and ultimately killed. And, I mean, I think Blackbeard, I mean, it's not like it was a sneak attack. I mean, where the location was that this was happening, I mean, it was in an inlet. Blackbeard was very familiar with the inlet. He knew that Maynard and his boat was there, and he knew that there was going to be some type of fight. There was going to be some type of attack. And possibly it could have been that he wasn't on his A game, because research seems to tell us that they had been drinking the night before the attack actually happened. And
something like pirates.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they just all of a sudden just were kind of, getting ready for it. But what was Maynard? I think his vessel was the Ranger, wasn't it? And is going up against the.
Yeah, I mean, he had several unarmed sloops that Spotswoods had provided to him, and that morning you talk about Maynard coming into conflict with Blackbeard. So the following morning, after being drinking and doing whatever it was that they did the night before, and Blackbeard launches a broadside against Maynard's ship. And there's a slight scuffle between the 2 ships. Ultimately, a number of Maynard's crew are killed or seriously wounded. Blackbeard comes alongside Maynard's ship, thinking that he's won the battle, thinking he's won the war. Unfortunately, Maynard and his crew, or a large number of them, are hiding below deck. So when Blackbeard and his crew steps onto Maynard's ship, they come out, and there's this violent hand-to-hand combat. And Chris, right out of a movie, Maynard and Blackbeard go at it, like the final scene of a great movie. And Blackbeard is basically taken down there. He's killed there in that fight with Maynard.
But it's interesting how he's killed.
Yeah.
And you think that there's rules of civility, or rules of warfare, I guess is the better way. I mean, there was a way that you fought on the open seas. I mean, there was, even though it was hand-to-hand combat, even though it was a war or a battle, whatever it is, there was still ways that you fought, gentlemanly ways of fighting, just like duels that we've talked about. I mean, there's a specific setup for it. And so Maynard and Teach, they get up there, Blackbeard, and they're fighting with their swords. And it was interesting that Maynard actually takes a sword and tried to go against Blackbeard and stab him in the chest, but he hit the cartridge box or whatever of Blackbeard's, the way he has his pistols off, and it actually bends Maynard's sword. And so, Teach basically causes Maynard to throw his sword away. And so he jumps back, and then Maynard takes out the pistol, and he uses the pistol against Blackbeard's sword. And of course, we know who's going to win, right? I mean, it's kind of like rock, paper, scissors. You know what's going to win. The pistol's going to beat the sword. any day of the week.
Gunfight, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, and so, there's Teach who gets shot, and I'm sure he's wide-eyed thinking, dude, that's not the way we do this. We do it with our swords, and by the time that Teach is able to get his pistol out and to get it loaded to try to, retaliate against Maynard, he dies from blood loss. And so at this moment on board, this boat, Teach, Blackbeard, who records say was shot 5 times and stabbed more than 20 times before he died. They didn't finish him off like that. Spotswood wanted him dead. Maynard wanted him dead, but Maynard also wanted his money. And the only way he could get his money is by showing proof to the lieutenant governor that he had killed Blackbeard. And so, Ray, what better proof do you have to show that you killed somebody?
That's right. You bring their head. You bring their head back and you post it on the bowsprit, and here's the head of Blackbeard the Pirate. We talk about Spotswood, we talk about Governor Eden of North Carolina, but both of these men's political careers were ended by their involvement with Blackbeard the Pirate. Spotswood would be brought down in 1722, largely because of the controversy of invading North Carolina, not killing Blackbeard necessarily, but sending 2 invasion forces into North Carolina. And then, of course, Governor Eden of North Carolina, though he's ultimately cleared of any criminal charges, his political reputation's never going to recover from being so chummy with a pirate such as Blackbeard the Pirate. So, Chris, we think about Blackbeard the Pirate and his crew and his many adventures. In some ways, it's very different from the typical Hollywood version of a pirate. This is a man who didn't go around killing people, didn't go around committing atrocities. Yes, he robbed people. Yes, he was a thief. But in his mind, I think he was probably doing what he thought he needed to do to support his people or whatever the cause may have been. So, Blackbeard is certainly a very fascinating figure. Chris, thank you for your research and your work on this. I hope our listeners enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. And I think it is important. There's one other fact that we do need to bring out about Blackbeard. And this is one of those lesser known facts that many of them know. And that through our research, we've discovered what Blackbeard's favorite color is.
What was that?
Orange. I enjoyed it, Ray.
On that note, if you would like to contact us, you can always find us on Facebook, Twitter. Just look it up, History You Didn't Know. You can contact us at historyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.